Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our online Bible study tonight. I want to welcome you to be part of our thought to think about, our question to ponder, and our text to study. And I hope you enjoy our time together as we study the scriptures together. As I say every week, it's not just a moment for you just to listen to me, what I have to say, but it's also an opportunity for you to meet up with someone else, be it in your life group or pair up with someone else, and discuss our question to ponder and our text to study in our small groups. As you're aware, for the last few weeks prior to Christmas, we were starting a Bible study teaching series titled Made in His Image. We've been looking at the doctrine of mankind, and we've seen that being made in God's image, what that means for us is that we glorify God in our lives by representing Him here on earth, the representing His kingdom on earth through our capabilities, through the complementary differences of our genders, but also, as we saw last week, by worshiping God with the whole of our being, spirit, soul, and body. However, this session, what I want us to look at is I want us to explore this truth that though we are made in God's image and likeness, that image has been broken. That image has been fragmented. And the reason the image of God on our lives has been broken is because we've been disconnected from our relationship with God. And the purpose for that, or the cause of that, is this word called sin. Now, I'm all too aware that sin is not a very popular word in our culture. It entails the idea that there's something wrong with me. It entails the idea that I am a bad person, or that there is something in me that needs to change. And we never like the idea that I'm a bad person or there's something in me that needs to change. In fact, some people even think that the word sin and the idea of sin is some outdated concept that we no longer need. And so instead of thinking of ourselves as bad, we like to think of ourselves as people who are basically good. But I don't know about you, but I'm very aware that you don't have to go too long and see and watch the events in the news to realize that our world is broken, that things aren't as well and as good as we would like to think that they were. That, we often try to, put faith in human nature as if human nature itself can sort of solve the problems. But when we look at our world today and we will look at human nature, we see that human nature also has a tendency to make a mess of things. In fact, I would even say that human nature has a tendency to look after its own interests first and foremost before being considerate to others. Let's give an example of this. Can you remember last year at the onset of the pandemic and the first lockdown? Can you remember trying to go into the shops and you couldn't buy food that you needed, or you couldn't get basic things like a loo roll because people were just hoarding and buying those things? It's interesting, isn't it, when circumstances change, when fear comes, or we feel that we're in a sense of danger, that the human innate default position is to act selfishly, is to actually think selfishly. And it's all right having this grandiose view that humans are basically good. Well, that's okay when everything is going all right in the world, in a prosperous society. But as soon as things change, the real side of our human nature soon starts to surface. And so I'm sorry to say that our human nature tends not towards selflessness, but very often our human nature tends towards selfishness. And this, in my view, gets close to the heart of the human problem. You see, as being made in God's image and likeness, yes, of course, there is a good side to our nature. And I'm not saying by any means that human beings are all bad. Of course not. We do see wonderful acts of kindness and generosity by humans at all times. But the truth is this: there's also very much a dark and selfish side to our nature, which I've already alluded to before. And the Bible has a word for this. The Bible describes this as sin. Now, this session, what I want us to look at is the question, really, what is sin? What do we actually mean by this idea, this word? And then later on, maybe next week, we'll look at why sin is actually such a problem. But to help us understand this concept of what the Bible describes as sin, I think it's useful to look at two of the most important and greatest commandments in the Bible. The first and the greatest commandment in the Bible is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. That's the first and the greatest commandment in the Bible. The second most important commandment in the Bible is this: to love your neighbor as yourself. And you know, if you live your life by those two simple commandments, you won't go wrong in life. I tell you now, okay? You will not go wrong in life. And so a morally pure life that is pleasing to God and actually a value and help to others is the life of a person who perfectly loves God and a person who perfectly loves people around them. That is what basically a sinless life is. Someone who is sinless is someone who loves God with the totality of their being and loves others as themselves. In fact, these two commandments of loving God with your heart, all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself is summed up in the 10 Commandments, which I'm sure many of you have heard and come across before. If you think about it, the first 4 commandments, that you shall have no other gods before God, that you shall not make an idol to represent God in your own imagination, that you shall not misuse or indulge God's name for your own ends, and that you shall enjoy your relationship with God, that you shall rest in His presence. Those first 4 commandments all deal with our vertical relationship with God, about loving God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. The second of the 10 commandments, that is honoring your parents, honoring your mother and father, respecting the sanctity of human life, respecting the sanctity of marriage, not to take something that does not belong to you, to be truthful and honest in your dealings with people, and to desire those things that are right and good. They all deal with our horizontal relationships and how we engage and how we relate to each other. And so when we think of this word, this concept of sin, sin is simply to fail to live up to this law of what I call holy love. In fact, I would say that sin is the very antithesis of love. Sin and love are complete opposites. I would not say that the opposite of love is hate. I would say that the opposite of love is actually sin. And that's why sin isn't so much about how bad we are. Sin is really about how good we're not. In fact, the word sin in the Hebrew language is actually an archery term. It literally means to miss the mark. You know, there's an example of this in the scriptures where the Bible describes some soldiers of the tribe of Benjamin. And it says that they were left-handed, each of whom could sling a stone at a hare and not miss. And the word for miss there is actually the same word for sin. So sin is this archery term, and it's used to describe an archer. When an archer fails to hit the bullseye, when the archer fails to hit the mark, the archer is said to have sinned. And so that means that given that God is a God of love, given that God has given us His moral law of holy love, and that means that given that God has given all of this, the commandments that He's called us to live by, that are summed up in those 2 great commandments, that to sin is to miss the mark in our relationship to God and in a relationship to each other. Now let me ask you this question on this Tuesday night, if you're watching it on Tuesday night or whenever you're watching this Bible study. Has there ever been a time in your life where you have put something else in the place of God in your life? Has there ever been a point in your life where you have misused God's name? Maybe you just use God's name in a wrong way, or maybe you indulge God's name for your own ends. Has there ever been a time in your life where you have taken something that did not belong to you and you didn't return it? Has there ever been a time in your life where you told even a white lie? Has there ever been a time in your life where you harbored anger in your heart? Has there ever been a time in your life where you have not perfectly loved God, or you have not perfectly loved your neighbor, or you have not perfectly loved your spouse? Now I want to suggest to you that if the answer to any of these questions is yes, and I can say yes to all of them, then maybe, like myself, you have sinned. You see, this all lines up with what Paul says when he says this: all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So, given that this is what sin is, I want us to unpack a definition of sin and explain what this actually means. And this is the definition of sin I want to give us this evening. Sin is any failure to conform to God's moral law of holy love in act, attitude, or nature. I'll say that again. Sin is a failure to conform to God's moral law of holy love in act, attitude, and nature. So sin is defined in relation to God's moral law. And so that includes individual acts such as stealing or lying or committing murder. It also could be attitudes that are contrary to God's nature. So they could be, for example, the last of the 10 Commandments says this: you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. And, so here God specifies that even the desire to steal, even the desire to commit adultery with someone else's spouse, is sin in his sight. Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, when he deals with sinful attitudes like anger, like lust, Paul insists that attitudes like jealousy and anger and selfishness, these are the works of the flesh, and they are opposed to the desires of the Spirit. And so this life of moral purity, this sinless life, isn't just about our actions. It's also about the attitudes of our heart. Now, however, as I mentioned, the definition of sin that I've given earlier on isn't just also about a failure to conform to God's moral law in our actions, in our attitudes, but it even affects our nature. Now, our nature basically is the internal working of our character. It is the essence of who we are as people. And the Bible is clear that even in our very nature, we are sinful. Well, let's just think about a year ago, guys. Tesco's, trying to buy those things, you couldn't get them. People tend to be inherently selfish. Before we were redeemed by Christ, not only did we do sinful acts, not only did we do sinful attitudes, but the Bible also describes we also had a sinful nature. When speaking to the church of Ephesus, Paul states this: all of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature, Paul says, deserving of wrath. Again, Paul emphasizes this when he says, but God demonstrates his love for us in this. This is how much God loves us. That while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Now, you know that just as you don't have to teach a dog to bark, or a cow to moo, or a lion to roar, you don't have to teach a child to sin. You don't have to do it. Taking something that doesn't belong to that child, or not being totally honest, it comes easy to us, doesn't it? Even from such a young age, even from childhood, we have this innate nature in us to do things that are not right, that are wrong. And so the essence of sin is not to live up to God's perfect moral law, and it affects us in our actions, our attitudes, and even in our nature. In fact, as I mentioned earlier on, and I touched on a little bit earlier on as well, sin is basically lawlessness. John says this in his letter. He defines it quite succinctly, and he says that sin is lawlessness. Now, what is lawlessness? Lawlessness is just basically saying, God, I don't need you to tell me what's right and wrong. I'll be the arbiter of truth. I'll decide what is right. I'll decide what is wrong. I'll decide what is sin, and I'll decide what is not sin. I will do what is right in my own eyes. That's sin. The Bible calls it lawlessness. Could you imagine if everyone lived their lives like that? Could you imagine if everyone just did that? I would just do what's right in my own eyes. Can you imagine the conflict? We'll get conflict, don't we? But can you imagine all the wars and the conflicts that happen in this world today because everyone has their own opinion of what they think is right and wrong, rather than actually thinking about what God thinks is right or wrong? That's what sin is. It's lawlessness. It's me saying I'll do what I want and I don't care what God thinks about it. And Paul demonstrates this in his letter to the church of Romans when he talks about the sinfulness of mankind. And he does this by appealing to God's moral law of holy love. And he says that whether the law of God is written, as in the Ten Commandments, which was given to the Jews, or it is an unwritten law that operates on our conscience, Paul says who by their behavior, speaking of the Gentiles, that the requirements of the law are written in their hearts, the conscience is also bearing witness, and the thoughts sometimes accusing them and other times defending them. In each of these cases, Paul clearly demonstrates that sin is a lack of conformity to God's holy law of love. And that's why sin effectively is lawlessness. So this is really encouraging, isn't it, tonight, guys? Okay, but this is how the Bible paints the reality of the human condition. See, given that sin is a failure to conform to God's moral law in our acts, our attitudes, and our nature, we must take it seriously. Yes, sin brings pain in our relationships, but at the same time, there's more than just a destructive consequence to our sin. It is also wrong in the deepest sense of the word. In a universe that is created by God, sin ought not to happen. Sin is directly opposite to all that is good and the essence and the nature of God. In fact, I mentioned before that sin is the very antithesis of love. And that given that God is love, given that God is perfect, holy love, sin is a contradiction to the nature and the character of God. And that is why, and this may be difficult for some of us to grasp tonight, but that is why God hates sin. In fact, I would put to you tonight that if God did not hate sin, God would not be a God of love. Because sin, as I mentioned, is the very antithesis of what love is. Sin contradicts the excellence of God's moral character. And so that means that as believers, and maybe you're a believer or not believer tonight, but as believers, for those of us who are believers, as we grow more in Christ likeness, as we grow more in our love for God, as our lives are conformed more into the image and the likeness of the Son, sin actually becomes more repugnant and repulsive in our lives. And so that is the essence of what sin is. Well, there we go, guys. That's our study tonight. That is why our world is so broken. That is why our world is so fragmented. That is very much at the heart of the issue of the human heart, which is really about the issue of our sin, of lawlessness against God. And that is actually what the scriptures and the gospel itself portrays. And very often we have to come to terms with this reality when we are actually approaching God and coming before God, and also how we engage in our relationships with others. Because remember, sin isn't necessarily about how bad we are, but it's about how good we're not. We have missed the mark of loving God perfectly with all our heart, soul, mind and strength, and loving our neighbour as ourself. Well, there's the thought to think about. What about the question to ponder? Well, the question to ponder is this. What do you think it means to love the sinner and to hate the sin? What do you think it means to love the sinner and to hate the sin? Do you think this is true and helpful? Do you think this is true and helpful? And the text of study, I'd like you to read 1 John chapter 3 and look at particularly verses 4 to 6. And as you study that text, I want you to answer this question. What is the antidote to sin in our lives? What is the antidote to sin in our lives? Well, I hope you've enjoyed our time of Bible study. And hey, go away, discuss it amongst yourselves. If you've got any questions, drop me a question at the email address below. I'll endeavour to answer your question to the best of my ability. Hey, have a great rest of the evening. For church members, don't forget you're going to be part of our prayer meeting tonight at 7:30. Drop me an email and I'll send you the Zoom link. God bless you. Have a great rest of the evening, great rest of the week. Bless you. Bye.